Welcome back, everyone. It's Dr. A here at History Surfer. Glad you could make it. I'm going to begin a lecture about Roman art for my art appreciation students. And we're going to start by talking about the difference between the Romans and the Greeks. Whereas the Greeks are the great innovators in art, especially as it confirms to the Western tradition, art historians often refer to the Romans as the great copiers. But I tend to disagree in that they were innovators, but it was more of an engineering bent. But let's look what they did in the demonstration of things like portraiture and sculpture. While we don't have a lot of instances of painting in any of these cultures in the early classical period, the Romans luckily have Pompeii. But let's look at what they do in sculpture. First of all, if you've not looked at the vastness of the Roman Empire in a while, here it is in 100 CE or AD, and you can see the Romans at this point had encircled the entire Mediterranean. Not only that, but they had jumped over, you can see quite clearly here, into Britannia. And so they have a big influence on the region, and it's a long influence, but it's this Pax Romana period that we really see the height of the Romans and what they could do. So when we talk about them artistically, oftentimes people just concentrate on the engineering feats, but they also engaged in portraits like this. We see portrait busts that are very much about the people. We are going to see wrinkles and imperfections. Unlike the Greeks, who idealized everything, the Romans are realists. I think they're so pragmatic. They had a type of ancestor worship, so this was important to them. So the wrinkles and the appearance of people, it's a real thing. So we do get to appreciate things like, look at this lovely hairdo. I mean, I always think, how in the world does someone manage to do this? And it influences the ideas of Rome when you see things like this. And it influenced Romans at that point when they were making these types of portrait. That was their portrait busts. These are sculpture. I want to make that clear. It was having a big influence on popular culture of their own time. So we can't say they're totally copiers, but they do follow a lot what the Greeks did, and they used a lot of the Greek artists that were practicing in the period, whether willingly or unwillingly, because I do have read things about Greek slaves who are artists. So we have to never forget that Rome was built on slavery. It's a big part of the Roman story. Romans, though, loved all things Greek. I'm going to zoom out a little bit here so you can actually see this. Isn't that a lovely hairdo? And so it does have we do see it play into Roman culture. When we talk about Rome, most of the time we're looking at things from the imperial period. But an unfortunate event for the people who lived then, but a fortunate event for archaeologists and historians, the eruption of Pompeii preserves, again, I'm just moving the camera around so you can see more of the image. Pompeii, the eruption of Vesuvius preserves Pompeii, so we get a really good look at Republican Rome in the city of Pompeii. Pompeii sits in the Bay of Naples, or near the Bay of Naples, I shouldn't say in. The Bay of Naples is right there. And there is a very large volcano there called Mount Vesuvius. You see here in this image, I'm actually driving in a car towards it, and you can see on the day that I'm there, it's puffing smoke out. It's a very active volcano in our period still. And the last big volcanic eruption there, as far as I can ascertain, was really around World War II, and they say it's kind of like on a 100-year cycle. But it is a formidable presence in this area where millions of people live today. The people who lived in Pompeii and Herculaneum, I can't imagine living in the presence of this volcano, because we know the year that it erupted, it was extremely active. They'd had some earthquakes. Italy has is on, there's earthquakes there, there's volcanoes there. It's definitely a factor in the development of Rome. And Pompeii, when it exploded, it was one of those cataclysmic eruptions. Again, like Thera, my students know what I'm talking about. We talked about the Greeks. It's seen from Egypt, and it's commented on. And so we know that this is a major eruption. When it erupts in two phases. First, we have the pyroclastic phase. The Plinian phase, which is mostly smoke and ash. It subsides for a while, and then we have the pyroclastic phase, where you're going to get a lot more rock and a lot more of lava. And this is going to devastate the city. The city itself was more like a resort town. Let's start moving that way. You can see here some images of eruptions. I mean, this coming at you, there's no outrunning this. And it would have just been all-encompassing at that point, sorry. But when we talk about Pompeii, we have to realize, here's Vesuvius, Herculaneum, the other city that was very impacted by this eruption, and there's Pompeii. Pompeii is a town that was more like a resort town. Think of Palm Beach. It was visited by the Romans from the city during the summer to get away from the heat of Rome. And so the residents that number would swell from about 20,000 to, at any given point, I've heard numbers from 50 to 100,000. It was a very well-to-do place to live. The shadow of Vesuvius, I mean, it's there, but it also provides some very rich soil around there. And there were some really well-to-do vineyard owners. So they were producing wines and stuff like that. If we go into the city, I'm going to walk into the Marine Gate. That's this way. We realize it has all the accoutrements of a very wealthy Roman city. So let's go inside. Romans were great engineers. Like I said, you can see Pompeii back there. This is one of the days I visited. I went twice when I was there. First day, super rainy. Second day, not so rainy, little cold. It was winter, but still much clearer. So you'll see the difference. And you can see paved roads, gutters, raised sidewalks. These are the people who invented this, everyone. These are the builders of the classical age. They have concrete. They make, and if you remember from the architecture lecture, they have the Roman arch or the rounded arch. And so it's very sophisticated control of water. There's wells. There's still drinking fountains there that you could actually use to this day. There's things like the major big homes would have had pressurized water brought right to them. They would cut those homes off like in times when it was a drought or something, and only the public water facilities would be available. But still, it's not as primitive, I think, as people imagine. Coming into the Forum, the center of the city, you're walking in, you'll notice there's like these blocks there. There was no wheeled traffic allowed into Pompeii. It was only, and also in the Forum of Rome, you had to be on foot. So you had to park your chariot somewhere. I don't know if you can ride horses in here. I've always wondered that, but I've never found any reference to it. But I do know it was mostly foot traffic. So we come into the Forum, and inside, let me go there. The Forum are going to be the main temples dedicated. In this case, one is dedicated to Zeus. And so that's this one here at the end, and you can clearly see Pompeii in the background. You'll notice the damage. Yep, this is all from the volcano and the eruption. With that hot ash and all the pumice stone and the lava, while marble doesn't burn, it melts. And so many of the columns are truncated like this. It's very typical when you have ruins. And you have to imagine this was buried in some places under 40 feet of hardened ash. They didn't really discover, if you want to, or rediscover, I think maybe that's a better way to term it, Pompeii until later in the late 1700s when some monks were looking for water and they hit something and they bought up a piece of roof tile. So I just thought that was interesting. Or, and those are things that I've learned, and that may have even changed now. I always say that, new scholarship suggests so many new things. But here's the center of the Forum. The Forum would be the center of the city where everything was, the main temples, the main government buildings, the main basilica, all of that would have been in there. So the Romans were great city planners. If we go closer to the Forum, or deeper into the Forum, I'm walking towards the temple on that really rainy, cold day I was there. You can see it's the Temple of Jupiter. I'm sorry, I said Zeus, that's Greek. It's the Temple of Jupiter. Sorry about that. I take that back. And you can see it was a raised platform temple. You would have had interior space in this. The Romans had designed these temples to be used inside, and it would have looked something like this. Quite nice and very fancy compared to when we think of the Greek temples and how you can't use the interior. Notice the use of Corinthian columns. That's what the Romans favored. They loved the decorative elements. And look at those beautiful little roof combs. Those are really nice. That came from the Etruscans, the forerunners of the Romans. And you would have gone inside and it would have been a beautifully decorated and barrel vault ceiling. Today, again, it doesn't look like that, but we can still see the bones of it there. There's two semi-reconstructed columns. And when I was there that day, the second day, it was beautiful and sunny. And if you can see it, notice the dogs sleeping. I went up to them just to look at the platform. And they kind of just gave me the look like Pompeii has a lot of dogs in it. That's the one thing I noticed. And I always had heard Pompeii was a dog city. And now I know why. They love to hang out there. The houses around the main Forum would have been the very wealthy, would have lived closer to the city center. And one of those houses that's famous is the House of the Tragic Poet and this mosaic that we see there. Mosaic work a lot of it was being done in Rome. It was coming out of the eastern half of the Roman Empire, so what we would call today Istanbul, but Constantinople eventually, named after the Emperor Constantine. And so they were bringing these artisans and craftsmen in to do these lovely, realistic mosaics. You can see here the Roman Cave Canem, beware the dog. And it's right on the threshold of the House of the Tragic Poet as you walk in. When we went into, this was another house actually, I saw the dog and I thought how poetic in a way, that you have this dog laying in this Roman house. The mosaic works, though, are really, truly super high quality. It tells us something about the people. This was on the wall of one of the villas. Most archaeologists think it's probably showing the woman who was perhaps the owner of the house. It's actually a painting, a fresco, of a couple that were engaged in, it looks like they were cabinet makers. And so this was on the wall of a house. So they had their homes decorated to tell something about themselves. Don't you love her eyebrows? It reminds me so much of Frida Kahlo. I've always loved this image. But that day was a devastating day. Again, we look at it as scholars as, wow, what a treasure for us, but not for them, because most of the roofs would have collapsed on the homes and they would have been filled with ash and then pumice stone. They had some pretty elaborate homes in Pompeii. You can see here a Pompeian domus. That was what these houses were called. Domus, think domestic. That's the root of the word. It's Latin. They had big interior courtyards. They would have had stables in the background, and these would have been, these really big houses like this would have been pushed out to the outskirts of the city. I'll show you one of them. And they would have been a big house with water running to it. Of course, slave quarters in the back here. And it would have been a lavish lifestyle for these people. Rome was rich, but it was rich at times for the wrong reasons. The interiors of the homes were very austere, comparatively speaking, to our ideas of plushness. It's a matter of climate. You know, the less stuff you have in a property, the cooler it's going to be. And you can see here they use beautiful marbles and tile work. And again, all of this stuff being done by master craftsman slaves. Absolutely doing this incredible work. They even had in Pompeii restaurants where they would serve, buffet style. This is a famous restaurant in Pompeii. You can see the serving area. It was everything you could want in Pompeii. Romans lived lavishly. Like here you see this idea of a banquet. Well, yeah, you laid around on couches and you ate and you ate and you ate and you ate and you drank red wine or white wine, whichever your choice. And it was entertainment. Romans believed they deserved this stuff. They were, after all, Rome. And then Vesuvius erupted. The people who lived here, many of them perished, especially the poor who were unable to get out of the city. In the Villa of Mysteries, some bodies were found, and we can see here where the water came in. The house was fed right there. Of course, I didn't think about the light post at that moment. I was so thrilled to see the Villa of Mysteries. And they were vineyard owners, so they made wine. And they would have been, like I said, a lavish lifestyle. We call it the Villa of Mysteries because as we go in, you can see that interior courtyard, which have looked something like this. And in a hot climate, you would spend a lot of time out there. But look at all the art and the decorations. But it was this room which scholars believe is a banquet room that gave the villa its name. Look at the beautiful red background. We don't see them being too concerned with the idea of perspective. As I know I've told you, those of you who were in the beginning of class, they're working more in an isometric perspective mode. There's no background or foreground, but it's fairly realistic, although there's some things like the floor kind of looks like it's bending here, but still it's working. We believe that this may be a banquet for a marriage because of, let me get to the image. They didn't let you in the room when I was there. These are images from Pompeii's site, but this one here, she looks to be a bride getting ready to be married as she's having her hair braided. In this area of Rome, it's traditional for brides to have, I've read 7, I've read 6, I've read 8, but anyway, lots of braids in their hair. Look at the beautiful Greek key pattern there, and that beautiful rich red with the putti, like a cupid, holding a mirror for her. And so we do believe that's the story. And I haven't read anything that disputes that recently. But Romans were, living this lush life. And they had theaters. You can see here the theater structure in Pompeii. And by the way, Nero had a desire. He was one of the famous crazy emperors to be an actor. And he actually had the theater covered in gold, and when he played here at Pompeii, but it is copied from a Greek form. This is not a Roman form. It is, though, you can see where all theater and stadium seating comes from. It's a Greek idea. The Romans make it a little better, especially when we get to this actual city of Rome, but certainly it's not shabby. It was the amphitheater, though, that became their signature architectural invention. Joining two theaters together, you now have an enclosed space to hold games that the Romans so loved. And I don't even know if the word game is right. Think about this. Death and destruction and animals dying. I mean, it's pretty brutal. If you go inside the amphitheater, you will, let's get in there first. It started to rain that day. I always notice the rain marks on my lens. But we went in, and you'll see it's closed up. Well, there's a reason the amphitheater form developed that way, and it's because the nature of the games. They have animals. And they have gladiators who don't want to be there. They're prisoners of war or slaves. And so they enclose it to keep things under control. And you can see there the seating, again, that stadium type seating. If you like sporting events and you go to them, you can thank the Romans for this form. And the museum, this was inside the Villa of Mysteries, actually. The museum's in Naples itself, but in the Villa of Mysteries and in the museum in Naples, you'll see what the archaeologists found. When they were digging, they were finding these empty spaces. While bodies don't last, they do leave spaces where the ash hardened around them. And so what they did was they cut those big blocks of things out and they poured plaster on them, and they made plaster casts of the people who were dying there. There's one of the more famous ones. He's laying down. You can see him covering his face. It's a gas that kills you. You basically choke to death. You asphyxiate. And this family that they found in a house, the mother and the child and the father. And this little boy they found alone. It looked like he has a handkerchief over his face. And of course, iconically, the dog. So Pompeii is the city of dogs. I always think of that especially after I went there. And it's an amazing, amazing archaeological find, as well as a glimpse back into Rome and the art that they had. Hope you enjoyed this part of the Rome lecture. There's more to come. I will see you in class. Have a great day. Peace out, everybody.